Week we'll be focusing on the integumentary system, which includes the skin and the tissue below it. It also includes hair and nails, the glands within the skin, and then of course skin disorders. So we're going to start with the skin and overview of the integumentary system. So skin and all of those accessory organs that we just listed. It is our most visible system. And when there's a physical exam, there's always inspection of the skin, hair, and nails, and that gives us a lot of information about the patient. Our skin is our most vulnerable organ because it is exposed to the outside, so it's exposed to radiation, trauma, infection, and chemicals that can be harmful. It also receives more medical treatment than any other organ system, and that specific treatment is called dermatology. You're going to become very familiar with this picture. You'll have a model of this in the lab. You'll be able to look at this underneath a microscope in the lab. And so we're going to start with the epidermis, which is the outer layer of the skin, but eventually we will get to all of these structures. So it is our largest and heaviest organ. It's 15% of our body weight, and two layers. The outermost layer is epidermis. It's made of stratified squamous epithelium, so layers of flattened cells, epithelial tissue. And then below that is our dermis layer, and it is a layer of connective tissue. Sometimes, but not always, you'll see below that is the hypodermis. It is another connective tissue layer. Sometimes it's on a picture of the skin, but not always because it is technically not part of the skin. Most skin is about 1 to 2 millimeters thick. It's very thin on our eyelids, and then thicker in between our shoulder blades. We also see thick skin on our palms of our hands and the soles of our feet. Those have sweat glands only. They don't have any hair follicles or oil glands. We'll talk about all of those soon. And then the epidermis itself is the thickest at 0.5 millimeters. The rest of our body is covered in thin skin, and here we will see hair follicles and those oil glands and sweat glands throughout the skin. The functions of the skin are quite a few. First would be protection. It's listed here as resistance to trauma and infection, but protection I think includes that first and second, the barrier functions, waterproofing, radiation, and protection against chemicals. I think all of that can fall under protection. It is the first step in our vitamin D synthesis, and then the liver and the kidneys finish that process. It is our most extensive sense organ, and it gives us all of that information about the stimuli around us, and also has thermoreceptors, which then in turn starts vasoconstriction or dilation, depending on if we are hot or cold. And can also be absorption of certain drugs through an adhesive patch. Okay, so we're going to start with the epidermis. It is the outermost layer, and it is made of stratified squamous epithelium. It is keratinized, and we're going to talk about what that phrase means. It means that those cells have keratin in it, which is a protein. The epidermis is dead cells. So the very outer layer of skin, what we see, are actually dead cells, and they have a protein inside of them called keratin. That layer, the epidermal layer, does lack blood vessels. So the blood vessels don't make it all the way to our outermost layers of skin. We depend on diffusion of nutrients from the connective tissue underneath. So there are some nerve endings for touch and pain, but most of our receptors are in the dermal layer. So when we look at the epidermis, we would expect to see 5 types of cells. You may not see all of them every time you look, and they might be hard to tell them apart. I think it's easier to look at the layers of the epidermis and dermis, which we will in just a minute. And within those layers, you will see these different types of cells. So in the deepest layer of the epidermis, which we'll get to layers in just a minute, you will see stem cells, which we've already defined as undifferentiated cells, and those cells will give rise to keratinocytes. Keratinocytes are the majority of the epidermal cells, and they are making that protein keratin. We'll also see melanocytes, and those types of cells make melanin, which is another protein. It's a pigment that shields our DNA from the UV radiation. And then we also see some Merkel cells, which are tactile cells, also known as touch receptors, and they are in nearby to the dermal nerve fibers because they're receiving that information and then sending it on past the nerve endings. And then the last type are called dendritic cells or Langerhans cells. They are cells that are macrophages, and they safeguard against toxins, microbes, and other pathogens that right at the skin layer. So to me, it's easier to memorize the layers and what each layer is up to and what type of cells than to just memorize the cells. So here we go. The top layer, or the outermost layer, is that stratum corneum. And that stratum corneum is made of keratinocytes. So you see the layers on the left-hand side of this image and then the types of cells on the right-hand side. So exfoliating just means they're falling off and they are dead. And then below that is the stratum lucidum. Stratum lucidum is only on our palms of our hands and the soles of our feet. We will not see it everywhere else throughout the body. Below that is stratum granulosum, and those have more keratinocytes. The keratinocytes are shown as the dark purple cells and the lighter purple cells, so they're both types. And then the largest layer is stratum spinosum, and that's mostly keratinocytes, but we also see those touch receptors, the Merkel cells, and the dendritic cells, and even some melanocytes and some stem cells are kind of all in that stratum spinosum. Actually, I misspoke. The stem cells are in the stratum basal. So the stratum basal is the bottom layer, and it always kind of looks like a wave. It looks up and down and up and down. It doesn't go straight across, mostly because it is kind of hovering next to all of those nerve endings, but that boundary between the epidermis and the dermis is usually kind of a wavy layer. And so that's the stratum basal. So let's take a closer look at each one of those layers. The stratum basal is a single layer of cuboidal, maybe columnar cells, but usually they look cuboidal. And it is resting on the basement membrane, and that's the membrane that is attaching it to the dermal layer. Here's where we're going to see the melanocytes, the tactile cells, stem cells, keratinocytes. Everything is in the basal, and then also in the stratum spinosum. The basal layer is where the stem cells and most of the cell division is going on. So they are replacing the cells in the outer layers that are falling off. Okay, stratum spinosum is several layers, so you would call it stratified. There's lots of keratinocytes, and it's our thickest layer. And the deepest cells are able to go through mitosis, so that's where the cell dividing is pushing newer cells up towards the top layer, and the dead cells are able to fall off. Okay, this talks about as they move up, the higher up in the stratum or towards the outermost skin layer, the flatter the cells are appearing. And then the granulosum is still more keratinocytes, and then some of them look kind of darker just the way they're stained. They have these granules inside. And then there we go with lucidum. It is only in thick skin, so we only have lucidum in the palms of our hands, the soles of our feet. It is kind of translucent, and it doesn't have, the cells don't have any nuclei or other organelles.